This is perhaps the cruelest of killers. Many people paid fortunes to him. In the hope of escaping the horrors of the Nazis, they ended up falling into the hands of the devil himself. Pay close attention to this story. On a Monday morning in March 1944, thick black smoke began to come out of the mansion's chimney at number 21 on an elegant street in Paris. It was a 3-story building with an inner courtyard and an old stable in the back, the kind of place that used to belong to the French nobility. But that morning, what was coming out of there wasn't chimney smoke, it was something different. A smell that stuck in your throat and went down to your stomach. The neighbors closed their windows, waited through 2, 3, even 5 days of smoke, and no one showed up to take care of it. On Saturday, one of the neighbors crossed the street and knocked on that door, but no one answered. There was just a note posted there. The owner said he'd be away for a month, so the neighbor called the police. 2 police officers arrived, and the residents of the street said that the owner of the house was a doctor who lived at another address about 3 kilometers away. They also said that, in recent months, they had seen something strange. People would arrive at that house at night, sometimes with suitcases, and then no one ever saw those people leaving again. A man would regularly show up with a horse-drawn cart, always in the early morning hours. The police called the doctor, supposedly the owner of the house. He answered and told them to wait because he was on his way there with the keys to the house. Half an hour went by, then an hour, and nothing, and the smoke kept coming. The police got worried about the fire and called the firefighters. A team then arrived, and since no one was opening the door, a firefighter climbed up the facade and entered through a second-floor window. He went down to the basement following the smell, then he stopped. There was a lit charcoal oven with something sticking out of it as if it were waving. There was a charred human arm on the floor. Around it, pieces of bodies in different stages of decomposition, stacked canvas bags filled with bone fragments, a bathtub filled with quicklime, partially dissolved human remains, and in the air, that smell the neighbors had been noticing for days was burning flesh, while the firefighters and police officers were still trying to process what they were seeing. A man stopped in front of the house, arrived on a green bicycle, pushing it through the crowd of onlookers. He was thin, pale, clean-shaven, wearing a dark gray overcoat and had no hat on his head. He was sweating a lot, was in his 40s, had dark, almost black eyes, and a calmness that didn't match the situation at all. He said he was the brother of the owner of the house. The police took him down to the basement. The man looked at the human remains scattered on the floor, looked at the oven, and said, without changing his tone, "This is serious. My head could be on the line here. He did something unusual." He looked at the police officers and asked, "Are you French?" The police officers found the question odd since it was obvious they were French, and the man with that firm voice explained that over there was the work of the resistance. Those bodies were Germans and traitorous collaborators who deserved to die. And if the police handed that information over to the Nazis, he and a lot of good people would end up being shot. It was 1944. Paris was occupied by the Germans, and the French resistance was treated as a sacred cause. One of the policemen, named Petiot, saluted the man and said he wouldn't mention the visit when the superiors arrived. He even advised the man to escape, and the man got on his green bicycle and left, calmly pedaling through the streets of Paris. That was the worst decision the French police had made in decades. Marcos Campos. And this is a story that takes place in a Paris besieged by the Nazis, where people spent fortunes to escape the horrors of the war under Nazi occupation, and they ended up falling into the hands of something just as bad as them. Let's get to know this story, which is quite peculiar. A fake escape route to South America. It killed dozens of people without anyone suspecting. What did the police find in that basement besides the bodies, and who really was that man with the green bicycle? That's what we're going to uncover together in today's special episode. Just go ahead and do the usual like and subscribe routine, and let's get to the facts. To understand what happened in that mansion, we need to go back a bit and understand what it was. Paris, under Nazi occupation, when Nazi Germany invaded and defeated France, the entire country changed overnight. Paris, the city of cafes and boulevards of freedom, became a city of curfews, informants, and a lot of fear. German soldiers patrolled the streets, the Nazi security police, informants, and the collaboration of the Vichy regime made Paris feel like a city where any conversation could turn into a denunciation. And for those who were Jewish, the situation became increasingly desperate, especially from 1942 onward, as arrests and deportations became a real threat. Many people knew, or at least suspected, that being taken away could mean never coming back. In this scenario, an underground escape market emerged, with smuggling networks, secret routes through Spain and Portugal, and forged documents for those who had money. There was a chance, small and risky, but it existed, to escape from that occupied Europe and make it. For example, in South America, where countries like Argentina received immigrants. Many of these routes were legitimate, operated by real members of the French resistance who risked their own lives to save Jews and political refugees. Others were scams by opportunists who charged fortunes and disappeared with the money. But as always, there are those who are and those who are not. There was one route that was different from all the others. On this route, the person paid, handed over everything they had, and simply vanished from the face of the earth. No trace, no letter, no body. And since Paris was at war, people disappeared every day, arrested by the Nazi police force, deported, executed by firing squad. No one thought it was strange that one more family had disappeared. It was just another name on an endless list of missing people. This route even had a code name, Flytox. It wasn't a random name, it was the name of a popular insecticide brand, one of those sprays used to kill flies and mosquitoes, you know? And the name matched in a macabre way with that clandestine operation, a network that promised to save people but ended in death. The Flytox network was run by a man who introduced himself as Dr. Eugênio. No one knew his real name, and that was the whole idea. He operated through 3 intermediaries, let's say, who moved around bars, Jewish communities, and underground circles. From Paris, offering something irresistible, safe passage to Argentina via Portugal with all documents included. The price? 25,000 francs per person, a fortune at the time. Enough money to take practically everything a family still had. But for those who were fleeing the Nazis, money was the least of their problems. Life was worth much more. The intermediaries instructed the victims to take everything of value they had: money, jewelry, fur coats, gold, diamonds. They said they would need it in their new life. And then they would take people to a discreet house on an elegant street in Paris near the Arc de Triomphe. When the victim arrived, Dr. Eugênio would receive them personally. He was very polite, articulate, and conveyed confidence. He explained that the Argentine government required every immigrant to be vaccinated before entering the country. It made sense. No one questioned it. And then he would give an injection, but it wasn't actually a vaccine. According to the prosecution and the most widely accepted version of the case, it was poison, usually described as cyanide. The point is that after that vaccination, the victims never left the house alive. The victim was taken to a specially built room in the basement of the house. This room was isolated, locked from the outside, and didn't offer an easy way out from the inside. There were metal hooks on the walls, and there was a detail that investigators described as one of the creepiest things in the house. A peephole was installed in the wall, used to observe from the outside what was happening inside. And after the victim died, Dr. Eugênio would collect all their belongings, the money, the jewelry, even the clothes, and get rid of the body. In the beginning, he would throw the remains into the Seine River, but when the Germans increased patrols along the banks, he started dissolving the bodies in quicklime and burning them in the basement oven, just so you understand the scale of what was happening there. When the police finally searched the entire house, they found 72 suitcases, 655 kilos of personal belongings, 1,760 pieces of clothing. Wool coats, dresses, skirts, handbags, men's suits, pairs of shoes, and among all of this, a child's pajama that belonged to a boy named René Neller, who had disappeared there along with his parents. That's because the whole family had sought out Dr. Eugênio, thinking they were going to start a new life in Argentina. Just imagine. Now, who was the monster behind this man? Where did he come from? And how does someone get to the point of setting up an operation like this? The real name behind Dr. Eugênio was Marcel Petiot. He was born in 1897 in Auxerre, a small town in the north-central part of France. Since childhood, he already showed signs of something out of the ordinary. He was expelled from several schools for violent and antisocial behavior. There are even reports that he fired his father's gun inside the classroom. In his teenage years, he was caught stealing mail from a mailbox. And when they took him for a psychiatric evaluation, the diagnosis was mental illness. At around 19 years old, he enlisted in the French army during World War I. He was wounded and exposed to gas during a battle, and he began to have breakdowns. He was sent to rest homes, where he was arrested for stealing army blankets, morphine, other soldiers' wallets, and even photographs. At a certain point, according to military records, he is said to have put a grenade inside a tube and placed his foot in front of the opening. To be discharged from service because of the injury, Petiot managed to get a disability pension. After the war, Petiot entered an accelerated education program for veterans. He completed medical school in 8 months and graduated in December 1921. He then settled in a small town called Villeneuve-sur-Ignon, where he began seeing patients, and at the same time supplying the black market with narcotics and performing illegal abortions. At some point in his life in that town, Petiot began to get involved with the people around him in increasingly dangerous ways. In 1926, he had an affair with a woman named Louisette Delavaux, the daughter of one of his elderly patients. She disappeared in May of that year. The neighbors told the police that they had seen Petiot carrying a trunk into his car. The police investigated, didn't find enough evidence, and closed the case as a voluntary disappearance. Many researchers consider Louisette to be his first victim. But instead of keeping quiet after this episode, Petiot did the opposite. He ran for mayor and won. Do you know how? He paid people, man, to disrupt his opponent's electoral debate, which made his opponent lose control of the audience. Once in office, Petiot embezzled public money, committed contract fraud, and connected the city's power grid directly to his own house so he wouldn't have to pay the electricity bill. He was suspended from office in 1931 and before being officially expelled, moved to Paris. In Paris, he set up a clinic on Rue de la Comartin and built a medical reputation there using fake credentials. He treated many poor people for free, which gave him a reputation as a benefactor. And behind the scenes, he continued prescribing narcotics and performing illegal abortions. In 1936, he was granted the authority to issue death certificates. That same year, he was briefly hospitalized for kleptomania. Then came the Great War, and the war was, for a man like Petiot, the perfect opportunity. While millions of people suffered under the Nazi occupation, Petiot saw profit. First, he started issuing fake disability certificates for French people who were being drafted for forced labor in Germany, which in theory could even be considered an act of resistance. But in 1942, along with 3 intermediaries, including Raoul Fourier and René Gustave Nézondet, he set up the Flytox network, which I already mentioned, and began killing systematically. The Gestapo, as strange as it may seem, ended up being the first to suspect Petiot's network, or Dr. Eugênio. They didn't suspect it was a murder scheme, they thought it was a real resistance operation that was helping Jews escape. In 1943, a Gestapo agent named Robert Yodakun forced a prisoner named Ivan Dreyfus to infiltrate the network. Dreyfus went in and was never seen again. When that approach failed, the Gestapo sent another informant, who managed to successfully infiltrate and identify Petiot's 3 intermediaries. They were arrested and tortured. They confessed that Dr. Eugênio was Marcel Petiot, but they had no information about the resistance because they were never part of it. Even so, they were imprisoned for 8 months under suspicion of helping Jews escape. Marcel Petiot himself was arrested by the Gestapo in May 1943 and was detained until January 1944. Some versions suggest that his release may have involved influence or money. But the central fact is that the Germans were not able to prove that he was part of a real resistance network. And that's where the scene we saw at the beginning of the episode comes in. 2 months after leaving the Gestapo prison, smoke started coming out of the chimney. From the house on Rue Les Sœurs, Petiot, the man with the green bicycle, remember? He managed to convince 2 French policemen in the middle of a basement full of corpses that all of that was patriotic work. After Petiot rode away from that house, things started to move. Commissioner Georges Victor Massou, a 33-year police veteran with over 3,000 arrests to his name, took over the case and conducted a thorough sweep. In the house, he found structures prepared to deal with human remains. The isolated room with the peephole, the bathtub with quicklime, he cataloged everything. The shoes, the dresses, the suitcases, the suits, the little boy's pajamas. That same night, Commissioner Massou received an urgent call at his house. He got out of bed, put on his overcoat, and crossed Paris in the dark under curfew. It was already past 1:30 in the morning, and Massou was still at the scene working. When he arrived, a telegram from police headquarters said the following: order from German authorities to arrest Petiot, lunatic, dangerous. And this is where the story takes a turn that seems like fiction. For the French police officers, the fact that the arrest order came from the Germans was actually a point in Petiot's favor. The logic at the time was that if the Nazis wanted to arrest someone, it meant that person was an enemy of the Nazis, in other words, a hero of the resistance. The police, who had already released Petiot hours earlier, were now dragging their feet to look for him. When they finally went to his apartment on Rue de Caumartin, the place was empty. Petiot, his wife, and his son had disappeared. Instead of launching a manhunt, the investigators questioned the construction workers who had renovated the house with the sinister chimney. And so they arrested his brother Mauricio, who confessed to having delivered the quicklime. At Marcel Petiot's request, they also arrested the 3 intermediaries, but there was no sign of Marcel. Petiot remained on the run for 7 months. He grew a beard, changed his name several times, and hid in the homes of friends and even patients, saying that the Gestapo was after him for having killed collaborators. And then he did the most audacious thing of his life, which for a man who had already convinced police officers to ignore a basement full of corpses maybe wasn't saying much. In August 1944, during the liberation of Paris, with the resistance coming out of the shadows and the Free French forces entering the city, Petiot adopted the name Henri Valéry. He enlisted in the French forces of the interior, the resistance militia, and he became a captain, not just any captain. Any captain of counter-espionage and prisoner interrogation knows that feeling of watching a movie where the villain is sitting next to the police, helping with the investigation, maybe even his own, and no one notices. That's right, Petiot did this in real life, but on a much larger scale. And he was literally inside the very system that was supposed to be hunting him down, and things got even more absurd. In September 1944, the newspaper Resistance published a report accusing Petiot, titled Petiot, Soldier of the Reich. What any sensible person would do was keep quiet. But Petiot, operating as Captain Valéry, couldn't resist and sent a long handwritten letter to the newspaper, defending himself and claiming to be a hero of the resistance. The police analyzed the handwriting and confirmed it was really him, and now they were sure, which they hadn't been before. Petiot was alive in Paris, so they circulated the letter among the police forces. And it didn't take long for someone to connect the handwriting and the face of Captain Valéry with the most wanted man in France. Then comes the most surreal detail of this story. According to the investigation records, when the police set up a new search team to find Petiot, Petiot himself joined it using Henri's identity. Valéry was called to take part in the operation, and he was assigned to hunt himself. On October 31, 1944, 7 months after he had cycled away from that basement, from that house of horrors, Petiot was recognized at a Paris subway station. When the police searched him, they found a pistol, 31,700 francs, and 50 identity documents with 7 different names. The trial of Marcel Petiot began in March 1946 at the Palace of Justice in Paris. He faced 135 criminal charges, including 27 murders. On the other side, there was a team of public prosecutors and 12 civil lawyers hired by the victims' families. The press turned the case into a circus. News reached Switzerland, Belgium, Scandinavia, and Petiot. He turned the courtroom into a stage. Defended by the famous lawyer René Floreau, who tried to paint him as a hero of the resistance, Marcel Petiot took charge of his own defense. He interrupted the judge, mocked the prosecutors, and questioned the witnesses as if he were the prosecutor. And when Judge Marcel Lazé rebuked him for doodling, openly showing disdain for the trial. During the testimonies, Petiot replied that he was listening, but that he wasn't very interested in any of that. His strategy was simple and shameless: to admit to having committed 19 of the 27 murders he was accused of. And he said they were all Germans and traitors to France. He said they were part of a total of 63 enemies he had eliminated in service of the homeland. When they asked about the Neller family, the one with the little boy's pajamas, remember? Petiot said he had helped that family escape with false identities and that they hadn't gotten in touch because they were ungrateful. Prosecutor Pan mentioned little René's pajamas found there in the House of Horrors. Petiot, unfazed, said that the boy had slept with him on the last night before the escape and that the family had left the pajamas behind, because he didn't want to carry dirty clothes with embroidered initials that could contradict the fake documents when they asked about a Jew named Joachim Guskinove who had disappeared. With 500,000 francs in cash, 5 sable coats, and also a huge amount of gold and diamonds, Petiot said that he was alive and well in South America. The prosecutors asked why they couldn't find him, and Petiot smiled and said that South America was a giant, huge continent. On the 5th day of the trial, judges and jurors visited the house with the chimney. As Petiot walked through a corridor of hostile police officers and neighbors, he looked around and said, "What a peculiar homecoming, don't you think?" The defense tried to present resistance groups that supposedly worked with Petiot, but the groups he mentioned didn't exist. No resistance leader knew Petiot as an active member. The organizations he described in detail were fictitious. And when the prosecutors showed that he had profited more than 200 million francs from his victims' belongings, equivalent to millions of dollars, his patriotism claim collapsed. The court convicted Marcel Petiot for 26 of the 27 murders, sentencing him to death by guillotine. The execution, scheduled for May 1946, was delayed a few days due to a technical problem. The blade release mechanism was defective. When finally May 25th arrived, the guards went to get Petiot from his cell at 4:45 in the morning. He was there, sleeping on his back with his hands cuffed over his chest and his legs chained crossed. He was wearing a black prisoner's pajama and was in a deep sleep. They woke him up and said the words that tradition dictated: "Have courage, be brave." The time had come. Petiot opened his eyes and faced the group around him. His neck was shaved and his shirt was cut to expose the nape. He asked for a cigarette. Lawyer Floreau gave him one of his, and Marcel Petiot smoked. Then he hugged the chaplain and turned to the lawyer, and he asked that if anyone published anything about his case after his death, they should include photos of the victims, so that maybe someone, somewhere, would remember seeing them alive after the dates he was supposed to have killed them. He said that would prove his innocence. He kissed Floreau 3 times on the cheek and they took him to the courtyard. The guillotine was set up. He looked over his shoulder at the men who had come to watch. They were all wearing their best suits and stood back because of the blood that might splatter. Petiot smiled and said, "Don't look, gentlemen, it won't be pretty." Seconds later, the blade fell. That was Marcel Petiot, the man who promised salvation to entire anguished families fleeing the horrors of war, and he himself was the very horror they were running from. The most frightening thing of all is that Petiot did not act alone or in secret. He operated right under the noses of neighbors, police officers, informants, and even the Gestapo. And then he managed to infiltrate the very environment that was supposed to be hunting down criminals and collaborators. Everyone looked at him at some point, but no one saw what he really was, or maybe no one wanted to see. The chimney house was demolished in the early 1950s and replaced by a new building. Of the more than 200 million francs he stole from his victims, none was ever found. Thank you so much for joining me. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.